Welcome to this online event by the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Angel. I will be the moderator of today's event. But more importantly is our today's speaker, which is Katherina Kinzel, with the topic, the history of hermeneutics and the hermeneutics of history. It's that way around, I hope it was correct. Katherina told me that her talk is based on a text of hers that will appear in the handbook on history and theory later this year on hermeneutics. So if you want to know more about hermeneutics or more interested topics, you might also read that text later this year. The handbook is edited by Giel van der Akker, who incidentally was our last speaker in this online series. So it forms a nice circle, if you like. Katherina herself, I would like to introduce her shortly. She received her PhD from the University of Vienna. She has had postdoctoral appointments in Vienna and Temple University in the US, as far as I could find out. Please correct me, Katherina, if I'm wrong. And now she's an assistant professor at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. Katherina has published widely on the history of hermeneutics, on the emergence of relativism in German philosophy and thought, on the philosophy of case studies and the relevance of case studies in science and in philosophy of science, and more generally on the philosophy and history of historiography. So before I end my short introduction, just shortly also on the format and the technicalities of this talk. So the format is Katherina will have two blocks of her talk, the first one 30 minutes and the other one roughly 15 minutes. After each block, there's the opportunity for discussion. If you like to comment, please indicate so first in the chat. I will make a list of potential speakers. Then when it's your turn to speak, you can either speak up via microphone, either with or without camera, or you can write it in the chat. People that have not spoken yet will be prioritized. So people who have not spoken and speak for the first time will move up on the speaker list. Please also mute your microphone during Katherina's talk just to avoid unnecessary noise. And then as a very final point, we, the people or members of the center and Katherina will stay on after the talk a bit. So if you are more interested in the activities of the center or in the topic, you can please join us afterwards and we can chat in a more informal setting, which would be great. And now, please, I give the word to Katherina. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thanks so much. I'm really glad to be here. So as we said before, so my internet connection apparently isn't very good, which means that if you at any point in this talk have difficulties understanding what I'm saying, please let me know, and then I don't really know. I just don't know how good I don't want you to sit here for an hour and a half without really being able to hear me, and it's a pain in the ass for everyone. So, you know, if that happens, let me know, and then we'll just have to interrupt it or find another way of talking about these things. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. You see the PowerPoint presentation? Yes. Okay. And I don't really know what you see. So do you see the entire screen?
Yes.
Or do you see just the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, we'll see your whole screen. So if you make the PowerPoint presentation big, then we would only see the presentation.
Yes, okay. Like this? Does this look good to you?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good. Okay, so I want to start this talk by saying that it is a little bit unclear what hermeneutics even is. So if you open up a textbook or you read an encyclopedia entry, then you can come across a variety of different definitions and understandings of hermeneutics. You might read something like, okay, hermeneutics is a theory of interpretation. It's a theory of the interpretation of texts, of cultural artifacts, and of historical events. Sometimes you might come across a rather different definition, where hermeneutics is considered a specific methodology of history, with a methodology of history that asks us to take the historical actor's perspective, the motivations, the desires, the feelings, the thoughts of the historical actors themselves into account. This is a very different understanding of what hermeneutics is. Now, sometimes you read that hermeneutics is not just a methodology of history, but that on a more fundamental level, it is an epistemology of history. So it is concerned with determining what are the conditions of valid knowledge, of objective knowledge in the historical disciplines. And then finally, you also come across this understanding of hermeneutics as a philosophical hermeneutics that is concerned with revealing the interpretative dimension and the inherent historicity of human existence. So how can we make sense of this plethora of different understandings of hermeneutics that at least on a first look seem to have very little to do with one another? One way of dealing with this is by going back to the history itself and by looking how these different conceptions and understandings of hermeneutic have emerged in interconnection with one another. And it's interesting to note that different conceptions, different normative accounts of what hermeneutics ought to be have very often been backed up by competing historical narratives about how historically hermeneutics has come about. So in here is one such proposal, the famous The Rise of Hermeneutics by Dilthey. Dilthey tells the story of hermeneutics as a progressive history of progress and unification. According to Dilthey, hermeneutics starts as an art of interpretation in the interpretative practices of gifted individual philologists who study the Old Testament and classical writings. But as they seek to transmit their knowledge and resolve interpretative conflicts, this then leads to a gradual codification of the rules of interpretation. So the rules of interpretation that are already at work implicitly in the practice of these philologists, they are rendered explicit and they're being codified and they accumulate. And then eventually in this process of an accumulation of these rules, a decisive breakthrough is achieved by Friedrich Schleiermacher. So according to Dilthey, what Friedrich Schleiermacher does is that he manages for the first time to ground these diverse rules of interpretation in a common universal theory of what it means to understand linguistic utterances in general, what it means to understand the meaning of a sentence, of a text, of a poem, etc., etc. So according to Dilthey, it is by solving this epistemological problem of understanding that Schleiermacher then also gives us something like the tools for arriving at the epistemological foundations of what Dilthey calls the sciences of spirit, the Geisteswissenschaften, or the human sciences. So these are the disciplines that are concerned with studying the historical, social, and cultural world. Now, if you think that there is something like a general or fundamental problem of understanding that solves problems of interpretation in all these different domains, you tend to think, and Dilthey definitely thinks, that there are these different levels on which the problem of understanding shows up that are very, very closely related to one another. This is first textual hermeneutics. So the question, how can we interpret the meaning of linguistic utterances, primarily texts? The understanding of mental life. So given that I only have access to my own experiences, I only have direct access to my own feelings and thoughts, how can I access the experiences, thoughts, feelings, desires, motivations, the mental states of other people? And then finally, this problem of an epistemological foundation. How can we reach objective knowledge of the phenomena of the social historical world? And at first sight, these problems seem to have very little to do with one another, or at least it's not clear why we should think of them as closely related. And so this is one of the things that I want to do in this talk. Is by going back to the history, I want to reveal the philosophical presuppositions that make it plausible for Dilthey to think that these different questions are actually just different sides of one and the same problem. Okay, but let's bracket that for a second and look at another historical reconstruction of the history of hermeneutics. And this is Hans-Georg Gadamer's reconstruction in Truth and Method. And for Gadamer, the history of hermeneutics is not a progressive history, but rather it is a history of a continuous distortion or misconception. According to Gadamer, the entire history of hermeneutics from Schleiermacher onwards is shaped by two fundamental mistakes. The first is an aestheticist account of linguistic meaning. Basically, here the problem is that expression or the writing of a text or me giving this talk is envisioned as a sort of original creative act that is irreducibly individualistic. And therefore, interpretation and understanding has to be conceived as a kind of congenial recreation of this original creative act on the model of the artistic genius. And this then, according to Gadamer, licenses a fixation on method by which the interpreter put themselves in a position of superiority over the object that is to be understood. So according to Gadamer, the interpreter tries to understand the author better than he understood himself, or tries to determine the objective meaning of a given text. And Gadamer thinks these two assumptions, they're super problematic. They originate in Schleiermacher, and then it takes Heidegger to liberate us from these distortions and to open up the possibility of hermeneutics conceived as an ontological project. I will say a little bit more about that towards the end of my talk. But I think what the conflict between Dilthey and Gadamer shows is that how the history of hermeneutics is told matters for what it is taken to be, for how we define it, and for what we think are the problems that it answers to. In Dilthey, we had this continuous history of progress in which Schleiermacher achieves the decisive insight, and that then warrants hermeneutics understood as an epistemological project concerned with the conditions of possibility, of understanding and knowledge. Or in Gadamer, the history of hermeneutics is a history of distortions. Heidegger allows us to radically break with that, opening up the field of a philosophical hermeneutics that is concerned with the ontological dimension of interpretation and historicity. So this was my little introduction. Now, what do I want to do in this talk? My goal in this talk is to give you yet a third historical narrative about hermeneutics. It's going to be very schematic and just going to focus on a few selected authors, but I think there will be enough to highlight some of the breaks and continuities in the history of the concept of understanding, and to identify the central philosophical presuppositions that were baked into this concept. And I want to show how these presuppositions make the epistemological program in hermeneutics that we find articulated by Dilthey, how they make that plausible, And then I want to partially defend this project from Gadamer, in particular, also its relevance for the study of history. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do in my talk. And so I will now focus on 3 authors, then we're going to have a break where we can discuss the questions that I've raised. And then we're going to have another 15 minutes where I want to return to the conflict between Dilthey and Gadamer. So let's start with the historical narrative. I want to begin with Johann Gottfried Herder. He's one of these interesting figures because he's, on the one hand, firmly rooted in the Enlightenment tradition, but on the other hand, he formulates a critique of the abstract universalism of the Enlightenment that in many ways aligns with and foreshadows the Romantics. One of the ideas that Herder attacks is the conception of linear progress, because this, according to Herder, is associated with a failure to properly understand past cultures. So Herder tends to think that the wrong philosophy of history, this universalist progressivism, leads to the wrong hermeneutic practice and makes us distort past cultures. And just going to focus on one of his early writings, this To a Philosophy of History for the Formation of Humanity. In this text, Herder argues that it is wrong to project our present values back onto past cultures, to evaluate past cultures in light of present day values and then find them lacking. He thinks that is drastically misguided. And he bases his argument against that on a historical anthropology of human creation and human formation. According to Herder, what it means to be human is essentially to participate in the formative process of history and culture. Now, he's also a universalist of sorts. So he does think that all human beings share the same dispositions and capacities, but he thinks that these universal human dispositions and capacities can be realized in a variety of different ways. So different historical cultures emerge because this universal set of dispositions is formed, realized in response to different environmental and historical circumstances. And although each historical age is connected to other cultures, it is also an individuality, which means that its beliefs, its values, its virtues, its vices, they form an integrated whole that, as he writes, has the center of happiness in itself. So it's kind of organized around its own center. Now, how should we approach the past given this model? Herder says, well, what is really important for us to recognize is that the present too is a particular historical age in the historical process. So it would be false to universalize the values that we happen to have at present and to mistake them for ahistorical ones. We are ourselves a part of history, and for this reason, we are not warranted in mistaking our values for universal ones and then projecting them onto the past. Rather, the past needs to be understood from within, from its own standpoint. So that means that our descriptions and evaluations of the past, they somehow have to reflect the extent to which whatever we find to be happening in that past culture, certain practices, beliefs, values, to which extent they were adequate to the historical stage and the circumstances that this culture found itself in. Now, Herder will often connect this thought of understanding a culture somehow from its own perspective with the concept of understanding. So what does understanding mean for Herder? I'm sorry, I don't fully see, wait a second. Better. Okay. So understanding for Herder is a rather complex process. And I'm going to give you a longer quote in which I think it becomes, you can see this very clearly. It says, okay, even if you lacked nothing but time, opportunity to change your dispositions for being an Oriental, a Greek, a Roman, into finished skills and solid drives, a gulf. Drives and finished skills are all that is in question. The whole nature of the soul, which rules through everything, which models all other inclinations and forces of the soul in accordance with itself, and in addition colors even the most indifferent actions, in order to share in feeling this, do not answer on the basis of the word, but go into the age, into the climb, the whole history. Feel yourself into everything. Only now are you on the way towards understanding the word. So the basic idea seems to be, okay, so we cannot become Greek. We're not in a position where we can fully become what we seek to understand. But we have this capacity for feeling. And feeling allows us to go beyond the abstract concept. Feeling allows us to grasp the whole nature of the soul, which rules through and provides the unifying principle, so to speak, of an entire culture. So feeling allows us to become Greek in the imagination. We can place ourselves into a different historical context, and we can then, in our imagination, develop the universal dispositions that we all share into the particular cultural forms that we seek to understand. So understanding is a sort of imaginative recreation in which, for Herder, feeling plays a central role. Okay. So here are some of the themes that we find in Herder that will become central for the hermeneutic tradition. One of them is this anthropology of cultural formation, according to which being human is essentially to create culture and history. Another theme that is important is the unity in plurality, the idea that there are these universal human dispositions that can be developed into a plurality of different cultural forms. Then the threat of misunderstanding is really central for Herder in this idea that the uncritical attachment to our present-day beliefs leads to a false universalism that mistakes the present for being outside of history and thereby also distorts the past. And now Herder thinks that an answer to that, to this challenge, is the practice of understanding in which we mobilize our capacity for feeling in order to recreate imaginatively a past culture. Okay, so these are some of the central themes that we find in Herder, and we're now going to move on to a different context. So with Schleiermacher, whom, as you've seen, is really central in both Dilthey's and Gadamer's narrative, we move from the philosophy of history to philology. So Schleiermacher himself, he was a Bible scholar, he was a classical scholar, and he very strongly builds on the existing philological tradition of the classical scholars and Bible scholars who came before him. But he also goes beyond them because he is the first to develop this idea that all linguistic utterances, whether we are dealing with a poem or we're dealing with the Old Testament, or we're dealing with the talk that I'm giving right now, or if we're just dealing with a shopping list, all of these are linguistic utterances that are requiring an interpretation. And this is because Schleiermacher thinks that misunderstanding is actually the norm, and it is not merely an exception. And therefore, all different forms of linguistic utterance actually require a practice of interpretation. Now, core to Schleiermacher's account of interpretation is his theory of expression. Schleiermacher thinks that speech and thought are related to one another in an inner-outer relation. So thought is the inner and individual form of speech, and speech is the external and communal form of thought. And just as when I am speaking, I am translating my inner thought into an external form, so is understanding an act where I move from the external form to the inner thought that is expressed in it. Now, Schleiermacher thinks that as we are dealing with any given linguistic utterance, there are always two factors that we need to keep track of. As he writes, every utterance has a dual relationship to the totality of language and to the whole thought of its originator. And therefore, all understanding also consists of the two moments of understanding the utterance as derived from language and as a fact in the thinker. And it is this distinction that leads him to distinguish a grammatical interpretation from a psychological interpretation. The grammatical interpretation tries to understand the utterance, the text, the sentence in the context of the language. Psychological interpretation, on the other hand, deals with the utterance in relation to the author, in relation to the person making the utterance. Now, I want to look at psychological interpretation in a little bit more detail, because this is what got Schleiermacher into trouble for supposedly thinking of expression as this act of a creative genius, and therefore of understanding as an act that requires congeniality. And indeed, Schleiermacher thinks that psychological interpretation is a sort of a recreation of an original act of the mind. So what we do when we try to give a psychological interpretation is we try to recreate the unifying, we find the unifying thought that guides the production of a work of literature, for example. But as we look at what Schleiermacher then says about how exactly we can do that, the situation actually gets a little bit more complicated, because here he says the following: to the extent that the thoughts, acts of the individual express in every case the whole determinacy of life, or function of life in the same way, the laws of psychological interpretation will be the same. If we now begin with the fact that the utterance is a moment of life, then I must seek out the whole context and ask how the individual was moved to make the utterance, and towards which subsequent movements the utterance was directed. So here it looks like understanding is not a congenial act of co-creating the original thought, but rather it is based on an understanding of the psychological laws that are involved in the production of a linguistic utterance, and it requires a lot of background knowledge about the historical context and the biography of the author. Okay, so understanding in Schleiermacher has often been described as a sort of a forming of a hypothesis on the basis of background knowledge rather than this act of genius. So let's look at how Schleiermacher transforms some of these hermeneutic themes that we have already encountered in Herder. So he clearly draws on this theme of a unity in plurality. However, he transposes this from the theory of culture to the philosophy of language. He thinks that universal language is the basis for the individual expression of the speaker. He also is concerned with the problem of misunderstanding. However, for Schleiermacher, misunderstanding does not primarily result from the historical difference between past and present. Rather, historical difference becomes a special case of a more fundamental difference that separates individual language users. So it's not false universalism that is to blame here, but rather the problem is our uncritical attachment to our own individual beliefs. Schleiermacher, as we have seen, two things of understanding as a recreation, but this is based on psychological, historical, and biographical background knowledge. And in Schleiermacher, the reference to feeling that we still found in Herder is actually dropped. And then further, I think this really is a novel contribution that Schleiermacher makes, that we find in Herder really only in a rudimentary form. And this is this theory of expression, the idea that the meaning of a linguistic utterance consists, that the semantic content of a linguistic expression consists in something like a thought or an idea that it expresses, and that this can be grasped as a sort of inner-outer relation, where we have the inner thought, and then we have the linguistic expression, the text, the words, the sounds that I am making as the external form that transports this idea. So I think this is really going to be really important for the later history of hermeneutics, this model of linguistic expression. All right, so we have looked at the philosophy of history, we have looked at philology, and now we move to what historians had to say about this. So Droysen is a part of the second generation of historians after the discipline had been founded and gained a professional reputation in the early 19th century. He worked on Alexander the Great, and he actually coined the concept of Hellenism. He also worked on the history of the Prussian state, and in his lectures of on historic, he tried to provide the historical discipline with epistemological foundations that would secure its autonomy from the natural sciences. And in order to achieve this, Droysen thought we would have to leave behind the objectivism of Leopold von Ranke. In order to formulate these methodological foundations of history, Droysen takes up the anthropology of cultural formation that we find in Herder, infusing a dose of Hegelianism in it. He thinks that the cultural historical world as a whole is a sort of expression in which the human spirit realizes itself. So he speaks of the forms or formations of society and culture, which are expressions of the spiritual life of human individuals and communities. And these communities and individuals, they transform themselves and the world around them in education and in work. Now, Droysen also thinks that there's a set of universal ideas shared by all human beings, but each historical age expresses and forms them in a different manner and to a different degree of complexity. Droysen is much less skeptical than Herder about the possibility of historical progress. He thinks that because history is the expression of ideas or of ethical forces, it is also marked by a progressive continuity of ideas in which earlier stages of the historical process, as somehow the more primitive or more rudimentary versions of the later ones, are still connected with them. So even the distant past is connected with the present in this continuous history of the development of ideas. And this is also central for how Droysen thinks about historical understanding. Understanding for Droysen is the central distinguishing feature of the historical disciplines. So this is what distinguishes history from the natural sciences, and also what secures the autonomy of history from both the natural sciences and from philosophy. So what is understanding? Understanding means that we recognize the formative forces in that which from them is still available. That is to trace back the forms which show themselves to be expressed in the given to that which wanted to express itself in them. It is necessary to understand. So for Droysen, understanding is essentially based on historical continuity. It is a retracing of that which wanted to express itself in a given form that proceeds on the basis of the continuity of the ideas that express themselves in history. And this is possible, according to Droysen, because the present is a product of history, and therefore, to some extent, it still contains the ideas of the past. And Droysen thinks that this also extends to the subjectivity of the historian. So the very self of the historian, too, is a product of the historical process and a product of historical forces. And because of that, by tapping into his subjectivity, the historian can also access the past. Droysen will go so far as to say that subjectivity and the willingness to take a partial and engaged perspective in the present are what provides the historian with a guiding principle for historical interpretation. He's also willing to bite the bullet on this and to say that this means that there can be no objectivity in history. Objectivity in history is also not desirable, and that we can only have relative truth. As he says, the known historical truth is only relative truth. It is the truth as seen by the narrator. It is the truth from his standpoint, his insight, his level of education. So what does Droysen do with these hermeneutic themes? We find the theme of cultural formation to be very central in his account of understanding. Human beings create the formations of society and culture, and this in Droysen is then merged with the theory of expression, such that the historical world on the whole is conceived as an expression. It is conceived as a meaningful reality that has a meaning precisely in virtue of being formed by humans that express these general, universal human ideas in the historical process. Droysen also draws on this theme of unity and plurality, arguing that the same set of universal ideas are developed by different ages in different ways. But stronger than the authors that came before him, he emphasizes historical continuity. And historical continuity not just as establishing the possibility of progress, but also as enabling historical understanding itself. Because understanding for him is rooted in the interpreter's embeddedness in this continuous historical process. It is rooted in the interpreter being a product of a continuous historical process. And this then also leads Droysen to put a very strong emphasis on the role of subjectivity. And here he has a very different perspective from Herder, because he doesn't think that the attachment to our present day beliefs is necessarily problematic, but rather he thinks this is actually a condition of the possibility of understanding. Okay, so very quickly to conclude, we have seen that this concept of understanding has moved between different disciplinary contexts, and that in each of these contexts, it has answered to different types of problems. For Herder, it answers to this problem of distortions or misunderstandings that are caused by a false universalism that mistakes our present day values for universal ones. In Schleiermacher, it answers to the problem that the author and the interpreter are both individual language users that express and use language in different ways. And for Droysen, it secures the autonomy of history. in all these authors, we find the idea that understanding is a sort of recreation of something, of a meaning content, of an idea, of a thought that existed before. So we're kind of recreating something. We're recreating something ideal. That we find in all of these authors, but they give a different account of how that is possible. For Herder, this is possible because we all share the same universal dispositions and because of our capacity for feeling. For Schleiermacher, this is possible because we can gain insight into the psychological laws that guide the creation of a work or a linguistic utterance. And according to Droysen, it is possible because of historical continuity and because we're embedded in the same tradition. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and we have time for a discussion. Let me see how I can
yes,
end sharing my screen.
Yes, you can also let it be shared in the meanwhile if you like. I mean, it doesn't really make a difference. But thank you very much so far. We already have one question by Patrick Noel. Please unmute yourself and speak.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the talk, Katherina. I really enjoyed the first part. You've convincingly showed us that the way we define hermeneutics, the way we conceive of it, is dependent on the way we put it in a history. It's kind of history-laden. I was wondering, you propose kind of your own narrative of hermeneutics. How did you build that narrative? Along what parameters did you yourself produce a historical narrative of hermeneutics?
Yes, I mean, I think it will be, I guess this is the problem when you split the talk into two parts, right? Because I think some of this will get clearer towards the end, because what I want to show is that some of these ontological themes or that Gadamer thinks are lacking from this tradition, I want to show that they actually are already there, that they are already there in this anthropology of human creation. So this has been kind of my subjective motivation for going back to these authors. Right? So my guiding, but another thing that I find important is to also see, I think there is a tendency very often in how these stories are told that there is a little bit too much emphasis on the continuities that are undoubtedly there. But I think what we can see is that there are these, as the problem moves from between different disciplinary contexts, there is really put to work to answer to new problems. And that changes what understanding means. And that changes how we make sense of the role of understanding in our various interpretative practices. So this has also been one of the goals of my reconstruction, is to show these different tasks that the problem, that understanding has been put to answer to.
Thank you.
Okay, then next up we have Tyson Retz. Tyson?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation so far. I'm just curious as to, I haven't heard the word intentions or intentionality yet. And maybe with Schleiermacher, I would have maybe expected that to come up with the series of points that you made there in connection with his hermeneutics, because I think, you know, once we start talking, I know you haven't got to the 20th century yet, but I feel like when it gets to the 20th century, this critique of this idea of having to reconstruct the intentions of authors is going to become quite a central theme. And I certainly see it in Schleiermacher and carrying through to much of 20th century hermeneutics and philosophy of history. So I was just wondering if you could say something about intentionality. Certainly when I read Gadamer say that the whole history of hermeneutics can be read in the phrase, it's the work of interpretation to understand an author better than he understood himself. I've understood that in my work to mean that we need to understand what the author really meant better than the author understood their own meaning, which is something to do with understanding what they were intending, what they were trying to do in a very Skinnerian, contextualist Cambridge sort of sense of what were they trying to achieve in saying what they said or writing what they wrote. So if you could just say something about intentionality, that would be interesting.
Yes, good, excellent. I really like this question, and I think it opens up a much broader set of questions that I unfortunately won't be addressing a lot in this talk. And this is the question of whether understanding is a concept that is essentially tied to psychology, or to because I think the problem of intention is kind of a part of the broader problem, whether understanding or the methodology of understanding commits us to reconstructing something like the psychological processes, the mental life of the authors, right? Whether it forces us to give ultimately a psychologistic account of meaning, where meaning is, and I think that's something that is, the question is this implicitly built into the theory of expression, that the idea that what it is for an utterance to have a semantic content is to be the product of a psychological act that is maybe intentional, I mean, maybe also unconscious. This is also something that is super important in Schleiermacher, right? Schleiermacher thinks that when Schleiermacher says we have to understand the author better than he understood himself, what he means is, well, we as we're not just in a better position to understand their intentions, we're in a better position to understand the unconscious process of creation that has led to a certain, that has led to a certain expression of an idea. And because we are in a better position to understand this unconscious process, therefore we can understand the author better than he understood himself. So I would say that the problem of intention is part of the broader problem of whether meaning, in the sense of semantic content, is something that needs to be accounted for in terms of a psychologistic construal of what an expression is. And I think that this is perhaps really one of the you really see that a lot of authors, including Gadamer and including Dilthey, are really grappling with these questions because they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to say that somehow the intentions of the authors or the psychological life of the author, the perspective, right, the lived experience of the authors, that really matters for making sense of the thing that we're trying to interpret. But they also want to avoid ever reducing it to that. They also want to, at the same time, allow us to give us a broader room for our interpretations that doesn't fix the objective interpretation on something like the intentional state of the author. And I think that's really something that we see playing out in the 20th century.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We have now two more questions or comments. First, Adam.
Oh, David was first in the queue, so I don't know if it matters, but.
But he wrote it later, the question. I will read it out later, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so I have what might be a very basic question. I don't really work in this area, so I'm just trying to understand it a little better. Stuff about like understanding as like in some way, like trying to get into the mental life of the author, like especially this Schleiermacher stuff. This is what we would, is this what we would like in modern times describe as like mentalizing or theory of mind, right? Like making inferences about the mental states of, you know, the people in the past whose utterances we're interpreting. Like, am I getting this the right way?
So yes and no. So I want to say yes first, because look, I mean, maybe I'm still sharing my screen, right?
Yes.
So I can go back to this. Right, so here in the beginning, when I talked about Dilthey, I said that Dilthey thinks that there are these three, that hermeneutics unifies, so to speak, these three different types of question. And one of them is what you would call mind reading or mentalization. This problem of, well, how can we access the mental life of other people, right? That is one thing that is going on for Dilthey, and that is really central. Dilthey thinks that this sort of problem, how can we understand other people, is somehow of the same kind as how can we understand culture. So if I want to understand what's going on in an artwork, or if I want to understand what's going on in a religious ritual, or if I want to understand what's going on, I don't know, in a particular political phenomenon, in certain institutions, social institutions, if I want to understand these sorts of things, for Dilthey, that is basically the same thing as trying to understand what's going on in other people's heads. So in this sense, I think you are right, but of course this is contested, right? This is not an innocuous assumption, right? It's not an innocent assumption to make that these things are actually related to one another. So, and this is why I would want to say, well, also no, because if you question, I mean, again, I will say a little bit more about that in the second half of the talk. But if you question that these different issues have anything to do with one another, then of course it makes sense to disentangle the problem of mentalization from the problem of interpretation.
All right, brilliant, thanks.
All right, then there was one more question by David who wrote it down in the chat, and I will read it out for all of you. It says, I really like the opening remark that there are many versions of hermeneutics. One of the authors who calls himself to be a proponent of hermeneutic is Quentin Skinner. However, I regularly struggle to see him as such. Do you have any thoughts on this? So is Quentin Skinner a hermeneuticist or not, I guess? And if so, why not, is the question.
It's been a very long time since I read Quentin Skinner. I remember him as someone who says, I don't know, very pedestrian things, and they sound very cool when he says them. And he says basically context matters, and it kind of matters to take into account the, I don't know what sort of an audience an author had in mind, those sorts of things, right? I mean, that's what I remember from Quentin Skinner. And yeah, I mean, that sounds a little bit like some of the things that Schleiermacher says as well, but I don't know enough about Skinner to give a qualified answer.
Okay, thanks. I think we have some Skinner expertise in the crowd too, so maybe afterwards, after the talk, we can discuss that again. So if there's no further questions, then I think, Katharina, you can continue with the second part of your talk. Thanks.
Okay. Let me see. Okay, good. So I wanna, with this in mind, I now want to return to this conflict between Dilthey and Gadamer that I've talked about at the beginning, right? So we had this progressive history in which Schleiermacher is the catalyst of progress, and it culminates in hermeneutics as an epistemological project concerned with the foundations of knowledge in the human and historical sciences. And then on the other hand, we have this idea of the history of hermeneutics being a history of misconceptions, of distortions that were first, that originates in Schleiermacher, and that has to be interrupted by an ontological insight. So this is the conflict that we're looking at right now. And let's first return to Dilthey and to the epistemological program. And as I've just said also in the discussion, right, Dilthey thinks, well, understanding is is an epistemological problem, and it is the fundamental problem that unifies these different domains of questioning different domains in which issues of interpretation and understanding might arise, textual hermeneutics, the understanding of other people, and the epistemology of the human sciences. And why does Dilthey think that these issues should be related to one another? And I think that if we look at the history that I've just given you, this becomes quite plausible. Because in order to think that these things are related, you need to make at least two philosophical presuppositions. One of them is you must think that the socio-historical world is a world that contains meaningful facts, phenomena that have a sort of semantic content, and that in this sense it is text-like. It can be that the meaning can be deciphered or understood like the meaning of a text. The second philosophical presupposition that you need to make is that understanding these sorts of meanings that we encounter in the social and historical worlds is somehow related to or similar to or analogous to understanding the mental life of other people. And now with the history that I've told in the background, we can see why the first of these presuppositions would be very plausible, because if we join this anthropology of cultural formation that we get from Herder with the theory of expression that we get from Schleiermacher, we end up with a picture where the socio-historical world, because it is a product, it's undeniably a product of human activity, is also a meaningful world that is meaningful in virtue of being an expression of something essentially human. And then the second of these presuppositions is that understanding socio-historical meaning is like understanding other people, and that also falls into place now, because if we have this theory of expression where understanding is essentially a relation between inner and outer, then we can think of the understanding of the socio-historical world in analogy with that, and say that also is a process in which something inner is recaptured or recreated from something outer. And this is actually exactly what Dilthey is doing, right? So he says this quite explicitly. He says, whether they be institutions, customs, books, works of art, such phenomena always contain, like man himself, a reference back from an outer sensory aspect to one that is withdrawn from the senses and therefore inner. So let's look how exactly understanding is conceptualized in Dilthey's mature hermeneutic philosophy that he presents in the formation of the historical world in the human sciences. Here, Dilthey argues that the objects of the human sciences are objectifications of life, meaning that they give an external form to the lived experiences of the individuals that participate in them and that participate in building them. And therefore they can be understood by tracing them back to these lived experiences that are expressed in them. So for Dilthey, too, understanding is a sort of recreation that is based on sort of universal human dispositions that we can all understand. So as he writes, when something individual is made intelligible on the basis of and by means of the universally human, we re-experience the inner nexus that leads from the universal to its individuation. So here too, really in line with the authors that came before him, understanding is a sort of re-experiencing that brings us from the universal to the individual. But now, what is interesting is that Dilthey thinks that what makes understanding possible are not just these universally human dispositions, but rather the shared meaning contents of the socio-historical world. These are the commonalities that allow us to understand one another. So it is by participating in shared social institutions, in shared, as Dilthey calls it, cultural systems, by participating in this shared world of meanings, that we can understand one another. This also has the consequence that for Dilthey, the socio-historical world is always already understood. It is already understood before the hermeneutic practice of the scientist, the human scientist or the scientist of spirit is even starting. And this is because on a very basic level, while the socio-historical world is an expression of lived experience in an important sense also already contains the meaning phenomena of the socio-historical world. Lived experience is not isolated and private, but rather it is itself already constituted by our capacity to understand other people and by our capacity for understanding the social historical world that we are part of. And for this reason, Dilthey thinks that the human sciences are actually continuous with life itself. So it is because the interpreter is inhabiting this shared socio-historical world that is always already understood by those who participate in it, that understanding as a method of the human sciences can even get off the ground. So understanding as a method of the human sciences builds on this more primitive, so to speak, or more basic understanding that already occurs in life itself. Now, let's see what Gadamer finds so problematic about Dilthey. As I've said before, there's this dual mistake, the aestheticist account of meaning and the narrow fixation on method. And with respect to Dilthey, Gadamer thinks it is especially the latter aspect that is very problematic. And here's what he says about Dilthey. In describing the methodology of the human sciences, Dilthey is at pains to show them as the equals of the natural sciences. Romantic hermeneutics here came to his assistance, since it took no account whatsoever of the historical nature of experience. It assumed that the object of understanding is the text to be deciphered and its meaning understood. Just as natural science always examines some present thing for the information it can yield, so the human scientist interrogates texts. So the problem, according to Gadamer, is that Dilthey thinks of meaning, of semantic content, as something that is objective and fixed and given pretty much in the same way as the objects of the natural sciences are given. And then if we just have the right method, we can determine that thing without ever having to reflect on the way in which we essentially are entangled in a historical process in which these meanings are continuously formed anew and reformulated and reinterpreted, right? So this is the contrast that Gadamer is making between the objective meaning as some kind of an objective thing on the one hand and meaning as this historical process on the other. And Gadamer thinks Dilthey is just guilty of thinking of meaning in these objectivist terms. And so for Gadamer, what we need to do in order to liberate hermeneutics from these methodological fixation is we need to think about the ways in which understanding is always essentially dependent on our prejudices or prejudgments for Urteile, which are these anticipatory structures that open us up to the thing that the object that we seek to interpret. And these prejudgments are always tied to our own historical situation and to our own self-understanding in the historical tradition. So understanding a text or a work of art or a cultural practice that is never understanding something as an object that is distinct from us, but it's always involved in a process of understanding ourselves as part of the historical tradition. So, and this is why hermeneutics doesn't actually give us or should seek an objective understandings of meanings as these given things, but rather it's always bound up essentially with the historicity of the interpreter. Now, I want to move to an evaluation of this conflict between Dilthey and Gadamer, and I want to give a partial defense of the epistemological program in hermeneutics, starting with a critique of Gadamer's historical narrative. Because I think what is very problematic about Gadamer's narrative is that he begins the narrative with Schleiermacher and then reads every other figure that he discusses as a sort of Schleiermacherian. So first, Gadamer doesn't really include Herder for some reason. And he doesn't, for this reason, I think he fails to see the centrality of the anthropology of cultural formation, of this idea that what it means to be human is to be a historical being, that this was in fact essential as a foundation of the entire hermeneutic tradition. And then second, because he reads all these other authors, including Droysen and Dilthey, as sort of Schleiermacherians, he misses that they too think of understanding not just as a method, but rather as a fundamental dimension of human existence itself. So the point that I want to make is that some of these things that Gadamer thinks we can only get from Heidegger were actually already present in the epistemological program in hermeneutics itself. So first, this idea of cultural formation, being human is to create culture and history, and therefore the interpreter is essentially historically situated in a way that cannot be eradicated, right? Remember that for Herder, the argument is that the present is never outside of history, and if we start to pretend that it is outside of history, that it is not just another stage in the historical process, this leads to a false universalization that will eventually end up distorting and grossly mischaracterizing the past. Droysen is even more radical in thinking that the present, and including the historian's subjectivity, is a product of historical forces, and that understanding is only possible on the basis of acknowledging the interpreter's embeddedness in this continuous historical tradition and this historical continuity. And I said tradition now because for those of you who know Gadamer a little bit more will notice that this is actually very similar to what Gadamer himself has in mind when he speaks about tradition. And then for Dilthey, we have this thought that the interpreter always inhabits a socio-historical world that he or she has already understood as a shared world with others. Now, I guess what Gadamer or what a Gadamerian would probably say to that is, yes, of course. I mean, all these authors have somehow emphasized that that the historian or the interpreter is historically situated, but their goal is nevertheless to transcend this situatedness. And I think that is not really fair to these authors. I don't think that's actually the case. I think that maybe this is warranted with respect to Schleiermacher. Maybe it is to some degree warranted with respect to Dilthey. But if we look at some of these other authors, in particular Herder and Droysen, these are not authors who seek to transcend historical situatedness, but rather what they invite us to do is to think about the ways in which historical situatedness informs the knowledge process, about the ways in which it is an enabling condition or a limit to understanding, right? Herder warns that if we uncritically, unreflectively attach to present beliefs, that will lead to misunderstanding. So it can be a limit to understanding. Droysen on the other hand, thinks that the attachment to our present-day beliefs and our willingness to take a stand with respect to those beliefs is actually an enabling condition for historical interpretation and understanding. So this is not a program of transcending historical situatedness. It is a program of working with our historical situatedness. So I'm now at the end of my talks, and I just very quickly want to take stock. So I think that Gadamer's criticism might partially hold for Schleiermacher and Dilthey in the sense that both do tend to see meaning as some sort of given that can be recaptured objectively. And to the extent that they do that, they do indeed under account for the historicity of the interpreter. But it's not true for the entire tradition. I think that in Herder and Droysen, we have, based on this anthropology of human creation, a strong case for the idea that meaningful phenomena are always part of this ongoing historical process that extends to the present and that goes beyond it. And I find that also to be reflected in the fact that both Herder and Droysen think that understanding and doing history has enormous political importance. And this is precisely because they don't think of the task of interpretation as something that is detached from whatever is going on in the present, but rather they think it is extremely important that we get to the right form of historic, that we use the right historical methods, because they have enormous political implications in the present and enormous implications for how we want to organize our conduct into the future, right? So their meaning really isn't, and the interpretation of meaning is not detached from what is going on in the present. So the goal is not to transcend historical situatedness, but rather to account for its role and its relevance for the knowledge process. So Pace Gadamer, I think that this problem that is so central in Gadamer's critique of the epistemological program, namely that of the historicity of the interpreter and of historical situatedness, I think that this is a problem that can be addressed entirely within the confines of the epistemological program. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Katharina, for your interesting talk again. As before, any questions or comments at this stage?
I have to say, I would really like to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, where is it? Below the share screen, you could probably, or above. I mean, I'm not sharing. Wait, wait.
Maybe it's, yes. Maybe this.
Okay, yes. Stop sharing it. Okay, there would be another question by Tyson. I also have a question, maybe two, but since I'm the moderator, and I still give Tyson the first word.
Yeah, mine's a very quick question. I have a ton of questions, but since you finished the last slide with by specifying particular figures, I just wonder where you stand with. Okay, they're probably not. You wouldn't think of them immediately straight off the bat as hermeneutics, but I do think that they're part of the tradition more broadly, especially the tradition that you seem sympathetic to, and that is the Neo-Kantians, the Ricoeur and Windelband. Could you? Because I think they're also, I think they would also be in league with the variety of hermeneutics that you're saying we should give more credit to. Could you just talk about that tradition? Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I've just, in case you're interested in this, I've just published a paper on Ricoeur and Dilthey, where I kind of try to trace how Ricoeur responds to the developments in Dilthey's hermeneutics in his own theory of historical understanding. So yes, I definitely think that they are part of this history. However, I do think that they, okay. So first about how I think that they are part of this history. So in Ricoeur especially, the idea that the human historical world is the distinguishing feature of the human historical world, and therefore the distinguishing feature of any sort of scientific method that is going to study that world is that it has to deal with meanings. It has to deal with meaningful phenomena that just are completely irreducible to anything that is going to just empirical or purely empirical facts, right? There is this dimension of an irreducible, and in the case of Rickert, value-related meaning content of the social historical world. And I think that in that sense, they are, of course, part of this tradition that carves out a space for the humanities as dealing with a sort of reality that just is not amenable to a naturalistic explanation because it is a world of meaning. So in that, I see them as part of it. Where I think that they really differ from, and this is precisely this issue that you have raised with intentions earlier and with psychology, because I think that the throughout the hermeneutic tradition, as I have reconstructed it, and as I've said in answer to your question before, there is this constant grappling with the question whether meaning has something to do with psychology, and where these authors always want to have their cake and eat it too, and want it to be, yes, related to psychology in some aspects, but not related to in others. Whereas Rickert and the Neo-Kantians, they are super clear because they have their anti-psychologism that comes from an anti-psychologistic interpretation of Kant. And so they're like, no, meaning has absolutely nothing to do with individual psychology. That's a complete mistake. Meaning has something to do with the realm of the ideal, with the realm of values, with it's kind of, it has maybe transcendental roots, but no psychology in there. So in that, they are very different from the authors that I have talked about today.
Okay. Yep.
All right, thanks. Is there any immediate question? There's still me. If there's nobody else stepping forward at the moment, I would just try to get to my question. Okay, my question is on the hermeneutics of history, then, or the hermeneutics of historiography. Dilthey, or maybe those authors, it's not their goal sort of to reduce the objects of historiography to what you have called socio-historical meaning, right? Because there are obviously forms of historiography, economic history, now big history is very famous, which do something else, presumably. They don't deal just with meanings. Maybe you need meanings epistemologically, you can't do without them, but they do something else. But that would be the question of, one question would be, do they reduce or try to reduce the explananda of historiography just to meaning, which would be doubtful if you look at today's historiography. And the related question to that is, I think this is a very famous phrase that sort of the sociocultural world is always already understood. Again, this is meant epistemologically only that obviously you have a background, you have a certain framework and background knowledge, or does it mean more radically that you would have to understand the world you are trying to enter already always? So what would then be, again, you go to prehistory or certain forms of history, you try to understand the world of a Sumerian scribe 3000 before our time. What would that entail? Is that possible in that sense? Yes. Maybe it's not. So that would be sort of the questions.
Yeah, I will answer your second question first because I think it's easier, and I think you are exactly right. I think this is why I think this really is a problem for people like Dilthey, who want to root the possibility of understanding as a method into something like our everyday understanding of the social world that we inhabit. The problem here is exactly that once you deal with drastic historical difference, it's not clear whether it's you to that, right? Because the lived experience that you and I share might just be so distant from the lived experience of, the Babylonian, whatever, right? So that it's just very, very hard to see how that is going to help us in reconstructing the social and cultural life of a culture so different. So I think that's exactly right. But, and I think this is, again, I mean, this is why authors such as Herder are still committed to such a strong universalism, right? Because they say, Herder is concerned with how can we understand those early cultures? And he thinks, well, we can understand those early cultures because we still share the same humanity. We're still part of the same human process of formation and education. And therefore, it's a thought that seems hopelessly naive for us today. But certainly, this universal, I think it's very hard, really, because you need some foundation for understanding. You need it somewhere. And either it's going to be something like tradition and or historical culture you're currently part of. And if that is the basis, then that's going to exclude a lot, or it's going to be something like a universal humanity that is super vague. Okay, so that was in response to your second question. And your first question was also super interesting, but I forgot what it was in the meantime.
There's also Joni Martin was talking, just very short. The first question was about the explananda of historiography, but modern historiography is not only about socio-historical meaning, because it's a two-faced question. Did these authors think that historiography should only be about socio-cultural meanings? And if that was the case, is that useful to understand nowadays historiography, which is obviously not about only about meaning? Obviously, it's also about meanings. That was, I guess.
Yes, I mean, yeah. So maybe it's most interesting to talk about Dilthey because he's kind of the closest to us. And so Dilthey certainly wouldn't think that we, for example, can, I don't know, reduce something like the sort of regularities that we would be able to capture with social statistics, that we could reduce that to meaning stuff, right? That's not really his model for how we would do it. But he does think that we always need to integrate it. So he has this idea that there are, how does he call it again? I don't know, I think something like the general human sciences and the individual human sciences. I don't remember anymore, but right. So the idea is that there are parts of the human sciences or subdisciplines of the human sciences, like economics, like social statistics, etc., that deal with regularities primarily, and that primarily deal with stuff that's on this very high level of abstraction. And then there's things like disciplines like history, or when we write a biography, or maybe when we do, I don't know, literary studies, where we're very much focusing on the individual, on the level of the particular. And he just thinks they need to be integrated. And so ultimately, and the framing for this, how this integration takes place, is framed by the method of understanding. So in that sense, the concern with meaning is primary because it frames the exchange between the general and the particular in the human sciences.
Okay.
I think it's a little bit different if we look at other authors, like for Droysen. He talks a lot about statistics, but I think he's really critical that would ever lead to a meaningful way of doing history. But yeah, so okay. It depends a little bit on which author you look at, but I think still there's a good, good, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. There's Joni Martina.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for this very rich and informative talk. And in fact, I don't have very much to agree or disagree for the simple reason that I don't know these authors well enough. So, but while waiting for others who are more in the know to pose their questions, I invite you to, if you could say something more about meaning, what kind of entity, or what is meaning? What do we mean by this entity meaning? I realize that there are different takes on it, but sometimes some of the authors you went through were talking about meaning as an objective entity. Other times maybe referring to psychological entity or being. And other times there was a reference to meaning as a text-like thing. But then one might think that text is just a text if you take it literally as just a black and white. And then only when we take something like a propositional attitude or, well, interpretation, then we get meanings out of those linguistic items. But I don't know, meaning is a complicated thing, but there's a lot of talk about meaning, and just to close, then if meaning is something really out there, something objective, are we getting closer to, you know, something like Phrygian or Popperian kind of meaning being in its own real, or anything? I know what you talk about meaning.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because in fact, I think that this development, this historical development, is precisely one in which this concept of what it is for a text or for a social phenomenon to have a meaning is kind of being, right? These are all authors who kind of grapple with that and who struggle to make sense of that. And so it's very unclear, and you will often find one and the same author using, I think, 3 different implicit theories of meaning, where on one of them, meaning is something like, yes, tied to the psychological intentions of the creator, but then meaning is also something almost like a propositional content, right? So you find one and the same author working with very different theories of meaning. I think if there's one thing that we find in all of them, then it is this theory of expression. This idea that meaning always has 2 parts. One part is the outer form, which is often the material form. So the fact that there are sound waves right now that are coming out of my mouth, or that when I write something down, it has this material form of the text, right? Black spots on a piece of paper. So this is the material outer form. And then this material outer form carries or expresses something inner. It expresses the immaterial, the idea, the thought. So this is important, I think, for all these authors, that there's always this relation of a carrier of the ideal meaning, and the carrier is then also thought of as the expression of the meaning. But it's nowhere close to being a consistent theory of meaning that these authors have. The Neo-Kantians have it, on the other hand, right? They are much clearer on this. But if you look at people like Dilthey or Herder, it's a mess.
But it's really the key enduring entity, isn't it, in this whole tradition, the meaning?
Yeah, absolutely. I would think so. Yeah, totally.
Okay, there would be Tyson, who has spoken before still. And I could also have another question if there's time, but I've spoken before too. So I suggest if anybody wants to still say something, who hasn't spoken, please.
Yeah, please, someone else come in before me.
Raise your voice now, otherwise it's either Tyson or me, and then the other one goes last. And then it's over. Then we're done for today. Oh wait, there's Henrika would still like to talk.
Hi, hello Henrika.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I don't know, this is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, great. Yeah, it's about, in the first part of your talk, you talked about these kind of disciplinary boundaries and sort of framed Droysen, for example, answering to sort of disciplinary questions or epistemological questions that arise when studying history. And I was wondering, how would you where would you put Dilthey? Is your argument that he's more kind of in philosophy, or because I mean, this is not so clear. And I think more broader, my question would be where would you see the difference, the main difference between Droysen and Dilthey and their sort of hermeneutic projects?
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. It's a good question. So I think that I would see Dilthey as, although he is concerned so much with the methodology of history and of the human sciences, I would think that he moves the issue on a more philosophical plane because he is really concerned with a classical foundationalist project, right? It's just that it's a foundationalist project, not for the natural sciences, but for the human sciences. And where is the difference? The difference with Droysen is, I think it's a really interesting question, perhaps to bring it back to the things that I've talked about now in my talk. I do think that Droysen has a much more acute sense for the situatedness of the historian than Dilthey does. And I find it interesting that although Dilthey is always labeled as this strongly historicist thinker, if you look at his actual writings, he is a very strong universalist. He constructs the entire problem from starting with psychology and individual biographies. So he's a much more psychologistic, much more individualistic in his understanding of the social world thinker than he is often made out to be, I think. And I think here, I think Droysen is an excellent example for a radical historicist, whereas Dilthey thinks that there's actually quite a lot that is not up to history, and that is just universally determined in virtue of our psychology, in virtue of our shared psychology. So I guess that is one of the differences that I would see. And I think that also maps onto why I think that Gadamer's criticism, that meaning is somehow taken to be this detached object, I think that holds for Dilthey more than it does for Droysen.
Thank you.
Okay, Katharina, we would have 2 more questions. Are you up for that? Do you mind? Or?
Sure.
Okay, then please, Tyson, go first.
Yeah, thank you. So my last question, I promise, is sort of stepping back a little bit, and the kind of conversation we're having, and this follows from what Juni and Georg are saying, in that the centrality of meaning and the obsession almost with meaning in the hermeneutic tradition, and I note that when I talk about hermeneutics or discuss the kinds of things that we've been discussing today with historians and people engaged in doing history, is that they're very receptive when they're practicing the kind of history that has been practiced over the time of hermeneutics, of the kind of thinkers that you've been discussing. And my inference is that that's probably because they're engaged in the practice of close reading. And it seems to me that a lot of what we're talking about here with meaning and understanding what to make of the words we see in front of us is very much the act of reading text closely. But the more I talk with historians with practicing new varieties of history, who read horizontally and not vertically, who read at a distance and not closely, the more this sort of discussion that we're having today just goes over the head. It seems like an historical relic in some ways. So if you would just want to comment on that observation, but I guess it's connected to this question, more concrete question I have. Is there a danger in ending, if your ambition is to rehabilitate epistemological hermeneutics, which, I mean, as you say, it's connected with method, yeah? So I'd probably call it methodological hermeneutics. Method and epistemology go well together, which is also, I have to say, I'm all for that. And that's why I'm asking this question. I want you to help me out here. I want to reconstruct methodological hermeneutics as well, but I find it very difficult in an historical, when the state of historical practice is such that they're not reading text closely, they're reading text at a distance. So therefore, is there a danger in us, in the plural, in us ending our accounts of the history of hermeneutics with Gadamer? because Gadamer is now kind of aged as well, and a lot's been done since Gadamer. And I'm thinking of a lot of work in philosophy of history and history method that sort of builds on Gadamer and sort of blends the different themes that you've been discussing today. So I'm wondering if your ambition to rehabilitate methodological, epistemological hermeneutics, what you think about sort of taking that a little bit past Gadamer as well. I mean, we discussed Skinner briefly, and I've written stuff that's critical of Skinner's interpretation of Gadamer and everyone else, but yeah, just interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a very good and a very acute question, and it's also certainly right that, I mean, all these scholars that we're discussing, or that I have been discussing today, I mean, they were all, they were approaching the entire problem from an idealist background, right? And of course that. So the idea is also not just we're concerned with meanings, we're concerned with ideas, right? Meaning is then thought of in terms of these grand ideas that are somehow there in history to be discovered. And all of that is very problematic. And I mean, I guess it also, but on the other hand, I would say it also depends on what current developments in historiography you look at. I mean, this is also not the newest thing anymore, but if you look at microhistory, and a lot of what has been going on in microhistory since the 80s, this has often been about giving something like a close reading of the lived experience of particular historical actors in their context, right? And of kind of trying to disclose a life world on this micro level that then also has a more general significance. And I do think that this is a sort of hermeneutic project, right? To say we're going to find the general in the particular, and we're going to find it by reconstructing the lived experiences of, I don't know, 16th century Miller or stuff like that, right? So if this is the project that we're doing, then I would say there's clearly a continuity with hermeneutics. Or I don't know, if you look at anthropology, I would say, right, even there, if the intake of anthropological methods in history and the focus on practices was always parallel, kind of what was running parallel to that was always this idea of culture as a text that you find in Clifford Geertsen and the people who draw on him. So I don't know, I would say that there are continuities into the present there that are still worthwhile.
Okay, I had another question, but then Joni-Matti came in, so I would be happy to cede my spot to you if you want to, Joni-Matti.
Well, you are the moderator. It's up to you now.
Well, as a moderator, my task is more to moderate than to discuss, so you go.
Okay, I'm curious about one issue. What's your message, consequence for the Anthropocene debate and the post-humanism debate? And well, very briefly, in the sense that this old tradition you're talking about very much builds on the idea of there being something like the human sciences and so on. While it seems that the post-humanists are saying that human is no particular, it's all of the same, and the idea of distinction between there being something particularly humanly, and that there would be human sciences who would possess something like a different method or way of understanding or could contribute to the, I don't know, cognitive discourse, something different from the natural world. So this idea of whole naturalization of the world and the sciences. What would you say? What kind sort of hermeneuticism and the whole tradition, where does it stand in this kind of debate and in this world today?
I don't really know enough about these debates to give a nuanced answer. But I mean, I guess I could say something very, I can say something very conservative here. I feel very bad for this. But to say something like, well, but I mean, what exactly does post-humanism mean? I mean, does that mean that we are in a position where we can transcend our limited perspective, right? Towards such that we can leave behind the human perspective that we have inherited and that we live in and that we embody, and to leave that behind towards looking at, I don't know, abstract relations between object agents only. I mean, that seems to be hopelessly naive, right? I mean, we are historically situated, and we are historically situated as human beings, and that's just going to be our outlook on the world. So, I mean, again, it's a little bit polemical and maybe a little bit too conservative. I mean, I want to be open to, I don't know, some sort of a transformation of discourse where we're not, I don't know, where we're at least considering that it might make sense to break these boundaries, or to question the boundaries between the human and the natural, and to question them. I think all of that, but I honestly do think that even the way in which we are going to question those boundaries is going to be informed by our particular historical and cultural standpoint. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that it can be a project that is somehow a project of transcendence, of leaving that behind.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me. But if you have time, and in this book that I edited, Philosophy of History, 21st Century Perspectives, there's a debate between Giuseppe Nadoro, who's kind of defending hermeneutic side from Collingwoodian perspective. And then there's the Zoltan and Marek Tam, and also maybe Eva Domanska, who are more on the other side. And I would be very curious to hear what you have to say about that, if you have time.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for your recommendation.
Thank you very much. So I'm not sure if I should be so selfish. If you bear with me, one more question by me, maybe in the audience as well. Please tune out if you feel like. I was talking about the explananda of historiography before, so maybe the ontological side, and now I'm interested in the epistemology of historiography, if you like. I feel like it's an interesting perspective to think about hermeneutics as a general theory of interpretation. And something that comes to my mind now that didn't come up in your talk is this notion of the hermeneutic cycle, which is it from Dilthey or is it from Schleiermacher? I don't know, you know that better. What do you think about that idea? I mean, that you always move between the general and the particular, and sort of, and that's how understanding is established. I think that's a very worthwhile way of thinking. And people like, which I really appreciate, like Peter Kosso in the philosophy of historiography, I have sort of linked that to a coherentist epistemology and thought that together. And so come up then with a theory of understanding and a theory of knowledge that encompasses both the natural sciences, because this process is just the same in the natural sciences, and the human sciences. So in that sense, you have an overarching epistemology of the sciences, maybe an overarching epistemology of understanding that might be based on hermeneutics, or at least on the hermeneutic cycle. Yes, that was sort of the question, or the comment.
I mean, maybe to clarify a little bit, and maybe I should have said this clearer already before. One reason why I think that it is important to distinguish between the methodological and the epistemological level is precisely because I think that on the level of method, we are going to find all sorts of different methods being used in a variety of different scientific disciplines, and no one would deny that, right? So Dilthey says, of course, regularities, the comparative method, of course, that stuff that we know from the natural sciences also plays a role when we are dealing with human things, right? So, and the other way around, of course, forms of interpretation, etc., might also play a role in some parts of, I don't know, if you think about how we have to interpret the behavior of the behavior of populations of animals, and kind of have to figure out what exactly they are doing as they are organizing their, their social behavior. So these, on the methodological level, there's going to be a lot of interesting intersection, and we might say, yeah, of course, there's hermeneutic, or kind of a general hermeneutic structures are going to, of interpretation, are going to reappear in some of the natural sciences. I don't think that's something that anyone would deny. The interesting question arises on the level of epistemology, so on the question of what is the knowledge base. And even here, if we look at it a little bit closer, we will see that many of the authors that I'm talking about, Herder in particular, Dilthey, interestingly as well, think that ultimately the sciences are unified. So ultimately they have some kind of a unificatory project. It's just that, so for Dilthey, this is the concept of life and his philosophy of life. And he ultimately thinks that all our scientific engagement of the world will be based on these very fundamental life relations. And then it's just that the human and the natural sciences draw on different types of experiences. But this is still an epistemological project and not just a methodological project, because I think a methodological project is just always going to be contingent. We're just going to solve problems, and we're going to use whatever methods we come across which help us to solve these problems. So we should also just be open for allowing a plurality of method. Obviously, the interesting questions, I think, are on this deeper level.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was a nice ending word. Before we now end, I just want to say again, this seminar will continue. We have a variety of plans for the spring, so please follow our social media channels if you want to stay updated. And of course, as in the beginning, now there's some time for some chatting and some other topics that we couldn't discuss. So thank you, Katharina. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and bye-bye.